Hey there, and welcome back into the Integrative Health Simplified podcast. I'm Carrie Cootie, your host, and we are back still in season 1, and we are up to episode 9 now. So within the seasons that I have, I do different series. And so at the very first of the podcast, we started out with simple swaps for your regular routine as a series that I did. The first 8 episodes are what the series entails. And it really was the super foundational things and this little swaps that you can make that make a huge difference in your health. And so those are the first 8 episodes. And so we're actually moving into a brand new series that I titled Common Health Misconceptions. And these are just things that you might have heard that seem really great, that might benefit your health, but there might be a little bit more to the story. And so that's what I wanted to kind of dig into in this next series that we're going to be doing. So this is the very first episode in that series. So if you haven't checked out the first 8 episodes, I think those are really important to start with to get a really good foundation. So go back and listen to those if you're brand new to the podcast. But let's dig into today's topic, and that is carbohydrates. So I titled this episode, Hey Ladies, Carbs Are Not the Enemy, because I feel that they often get a super bad rap. And this kind of goes back to the episode I did on extremes. Are health extremes the answer? That was what we discussed in episode 7. And so if you haven't listened to that episode, it might be a good one to listen to. Maybe you pause this one and go back and listen to that one, or just after you get done with this episode. I think it's good to really think about the mindset that we're going into and how we're approaching our health. So that's episode 7 if you want to check that out. But I want to talk about carbs because they do get a bad rap, and they're often the first to go when we think about a macronutrient group. Oftentimes we will know that protein's really good for us. They know we need healthy fats. However, carbs are something that can get the axe, right? They can get the cut because technically we can sustain life with no carbs. However, there is a cost to that. There's always a cost when you cut out an entire macronutrient group and an entire, and don't consume food in the way that it was meant to be consumed, which is as a whole, and that has a lot of different types of micro and macronutrients. So let's kind of dig into that. So carbs are important because they help support a lot of different processes in our body. And so I'm going to kind of list them out, and then we're maybe going to go into each one in a little bit more detail so you understand. I still want to keep this simplified though. So this is just scratching the surface on this topic, but I like to give you bite-sized information, bite-sized pieces of information that you can easily digest. So carbs are important because they support liver detoxification, they support thyroid function, they support muscle recovery, brain function, hormonal health. They play a big role with like the menstrual cycle, metabolism, huge with metabolism, and just the way our body recovers and manages stress. And so at a very basic level, carbs turn into glucose, and glucose is how our cells make energy. That is across the board. Nobody's cells make energy a different way, right? This is human physiology that our cells need glucose to make energy. And obviously our body needs energy to run optimally. So you can see how this is really important. So in general, if you think about if your body has more energy, there are oftentimes less disease type symptoms that come up, right? If our body has less energy, then there's a lot more opportunity for symptoms and disease to be present. Just because if our body has enough energy, it's going to run optimally. There's just going to be less room for those symptoms and the disease to stick around. In general, there's always exceptions to these types of rules. But if you're coming from more of like a low carb way of eating, these are some things to just consider in maybe shifting your mindset with carbs. So as I said, carbs turn into glucose, and glucose is our body's preferred source of energy. So beyond just, thinking about if you've been eating low carb, our stress hormones are really, they play a huge role in how our body runs as a whole, and the impacts that they have, like kind of the ripple effect, is really wide. And so in general, when our body doesn't have glucose, right? I said glucose is the preferred source of energy for our cells. It can make its own energy source. However, that takes stress hormones, which have a damaging effect on your body over time. Again, these are things that create ripple effects. Again, our body can sustain itself without energy in the source of glucose, most likely from carbs. However, it's going to come at a cost. And so I think that there's a lot of different, things that I've seen over the years in the holistic health world, especially because a lot of people, are on like more of a carnivore diet or a keto diet. And this kind of goes back to that extreme mentality, which is in episode 7 that I sort of talked about that. But they come from that mentality of, I feel really good on this type of diet. I've lost a lot of weight on this type of diet. And it's not that our body can't survive on a diet like that. It's really just, it's the time period that you're on it. I'm not saying that those things might not have benefits for a short amount of time and for a specific reason. However, the problem is when we experience those types of benefits, we sort of just want to keep going. We forget that we're circumventing the system. And again, you can circumvent the system for a little bit, but over time, you're going to really start to see ripple effects from that decision. So back to the things and the ways that carbohydrates work in our body. So they really do affect muscle growth. So our body requires glucose for energy, as I mentioned. So we need energy to enable growth and repair of tissues and all those types of things. Also plays a big role in the metabolism and to maintain body temperature and to fuel our daily activities, of course, which would be like digesting food. This can play a big role in your gut health even, and the way that you digest food if you don't have the correct energy source. Our thyroid is super dependent on glucose for energy. And really, carbs are a huge way that we really help our thyroid thrive and the ways that it wants to, right? Our thyroid is converting inactive thyroid to active thyroid so that it can do everything it needs to do in our body. And so that is actually decreased when we don't have the right fuel source. We don't have enough of those nutrients because we have a slower metabolism. And so this kind of is all connected. I hope you can see that. Liver detox is a really big one when you think about glucose, because our liver requires glucose to properly detox. When we don't have enough glucose, we will kind of have what I call a sluggish liver. And this results in a lot of different things, like the amount of information that I've learned about the liver and the amount of times that I've seen somebody's liver struggling and sluggish is a lot in the last few years. It's just kind of amazing how so many things are linked to a sluggish liver. So if you have that, if you're experiencing that, a lot of times we're going to have hormonal imbalances because we have a backup of estrogen. If our liver isn't working like it needs to and performing optimally, the services that it provides us are going to get backed up. And so if you have excess estrogen, you could have endotoxin buildup because we're just not getting that phase 1, 2, and 3 detoxification occurring properly in our body. And digestive issues are a really big issue that oftentimes are not really linked to the liver and linked to it making sure it has the right food source as far as glucose and carbs to properly perform. And this was one way that I saw play out in my own health. And so I have had a good bit of digestive issues over the years, specifically constipation. And so I have tried a million things like protocols and supplements and diet changes and all of these things. But it wasn't until I kind of linked it back to my liver not producing enough bile, really being sluggish, that I realized, oh, this is more than just contained in my gut, right? These are other things that are affecting my gut. And also it was definitely linked to a sluggish metabolism that I had that was showing up in that way. And so what I realized was, and I talk again more about this in episode 7, is that I did come from more of a restrictive mentality. And so for so long, I was doing these ways of eating that cut out a lot of food groups. And it wasn't that I necessarily cut out all carbs. Like I really never, I'd never really felt like that's the way that I wanted to go. Right. I think that we're all on our certain journey, and we have different experiences for different reasons, but I never really felt super pulled to cut out all carbs. I've certainly cut out a lot of other things in my days of restrictive eating, but carbs was never one of them. However, I think when I was cutting out all these other things, I just wasn't eating a lot of carbs and I didn't realize it. And so that's what I see in a lot of women that I work with, and they'll start filling out the food journal and I'll be like, there was barely any carbs like in your entire daily diet. And they're like, oh, I didn't even realize that. And so I think it's really a mindset that we've kind of adapted over time. Maybe you haven't been super duper strict with no carbs. However, I think it's just a general misconception that we have that carbs are not necessarily the best things that we can be eating. And certainly we need to eat carbs paired with a protein because that helps our body digest it properly. And of course, the fat as well. So these are just things that I've learned over the years. And just particularly with my personal story, it just made a huge difference when I started adding back in more carbs. I started not fearing sugars, natural sugars, even, some that I was like calling before processed sugars, just being more open to the fact that sugar really wasn't the enemy. And this is like a total other episode in itself. So I'll have to bring that to you at another date. But it's a topic that I'm very passionate about because it made a huge difference in my own health. But liver is very, very, very key, especially in women, I believe. And so this is why we need carbs for proper liver detox. And so what carbs are best? You might be thinking that as well. So we want to think about, I think sometimes also when we think about carbs, we're like processed carbs. I'm not necessarily talking about processed carbs. I'm talking about naturally occurring in nature carbs. These are things like fruit. Fruit is incredibly good for us, especially as women, for a lot of different reasons. High quality sugars are not to be feared, honestly. Like, I shared, again, back in that episode 7, where I cut out all refined sugar and I was eating very little, like naturally occurring sugar, like not a lot of fruit, not a lot of like honey, different things like that for like 2 years. And my liver was probably going, what are you doing to me? So these are things that really changed a lot for me when I started looking at them with a different lens. And so easily digestible fruit is very easily digested and a great source of mineral and nutrient rich carbs. High quality sugars, so honey, dates, coconuts, sugar, real maple syrup. Root vegetables also can be, and just vegetables in general. Obviously, some have more carbs than others, but that can be a really great source also. So those are just a few. Again, we're not into having a list of things to follow, right? We're trying to get out of that mentality. So I just wanted to give you a few carb sources that are really important to add in to your daily diet. And so I think it's also important just to consider how to add in carbs if you're not eating very many right now, because that can be something that sort of deters people. Maybe they're not eating any carbs, but then they go to eating a lot of carbs and they have a lot of weight gain, or they have a lot of blood sugar instability or something, drastic. And they're like, oh, I need to go back to not eating any carbs. There's definitely a wrong way to do it. And there's more of a supportive way to do it. So I just want to give you 3 things to keep in mind when you think about adding carbs back in, or just making sure you're getting enough carbs. So just go slow is the first thing, because if you haven't been eating very many carbs for a while and you go to add them in really quickly, your metabolism really hasn't caught up. So that's something that's important. And you want to just focus on easily digestible carbs like fruits. Root vegetables are usually the best. Obviously, other things can be like rice, homemade sourdough bread, those types of things, as you can tolerate them. But that's just something you want to go slow with and see how your body does. 2, always pair your carbs with a protein. Super important. This is going to help your body process it in a really, in an optimal way. And it's going to help reduce blood sugar instability that can sometimes come with carbohydrates. So that's just really important to always pair carbs with a protein. And usually the protein has fat. So I didn't include that, but protein, carbs, and fat is really just a combination you should always be looking for. And then number 3 is just trial and error. So everybody is different. Everybody's at a different place in their health journey. They have a different background as far as what they've tried and how their metabolism is functioning. Like, there's so many different variables, but trial and error is really important. The ratios might be different that your body needs as far as like the macronutrients. So most women, though, do well with 40% carbs, 30% fat, and 30% protein. That's just like a general rule of thumb. I think it's good to know, though, where you're at and then where you might want to go so that you can do it in a really good way. And so if you're not familiar with like tracking all of these things, you can just use MyFitnessPal. That's a really great app to kind of track what you're eating, and you can put in what you're eating and it'll kind of calculate what the macronutrients are that are related to that food. And it will just help you to kind of get a good grasp on where you at with some of these ratios. And I'm not suggesting that you start tracking these things super in depth. However, I think it is good to know where we're at so that we can know if we need to kind of swap things up so that we can have optimal function in our body. So these are just some things to keep in mind with carbs. And I hope you got a good idea of why they're needed, why it's important to really maintain optimal energy in our body from this source, because that is how our body was made to function. And so if we want to go with that for optimal health, obviously, then carbs need to be in our diet. And not to mention, guys, they're delicious. In the episode before this, I'm talking about butter, which is also delicious. So like, I'm trying to help you out. Let's have joy with our food again, that actually is going to support our health anyway, right? I feel like so many times we feel like we have to cut out everything that's good if we're going to be on a health journey. And that is so not true. I think that in itself is a common misconception. So take this information, let it sink in, see where you're at, and see where you might need to make some tweaks and maybe just change your mindset around carbs. I hope this helps you to do that, because I want you to just thrive. I want you to have the energy to do all God has called you to. I want you to have joy in your daily life. And sometimes I think that the common health misconceptions that are out there has sucked the joy out of your life. And if that's you, I hope that you continue to learn with me in these different episodes, and that you will just know that our Heavenly Father wants us to have joy in our daily life, and He wants us to have energy, and He wants us to feel good. And I get that sometimes that might not come on this side of heaven. However, I do think that society and culture has really skewed our view on a lot of things that maybe they've called supportive to our health, but are actually not. So hopefully this episode has served you. And if it has, I would just love for you to share any of those takeaways and tag me over on Instagram, just so we can all learn together. And if you have any questions and you want to continue this conversation, you can definitely reach out to me via the ways that I have linked below in the show notes. Or if you're watching this as a YouTube video, I have that in the description of the video as well. All right, guys, I will see you on the next episode.